The first half of today's program is going to be an introduction to Maine's redistricting process. So you can see all of the different elements we're going to touch on. We'll have a Q&A. Part 2 will be on prison gerrymandering. And so we have a very special guest joining us for that. And then we'll also have a Q&A at the end of that. And just a very quick thank you to our co-sponsors, Maine Women's Lobby, Maine Conservation Voters, Maine Youth Power, and Planned Parenthood. So my name is Will Hayward. I'm the Advocacy Program Coordinator for the League of Women Voters of Maine. Joining me today is John Brodigan, Policy Counsel for the League, and 3 important members of our volunteer team, Matthew Schaefer, Ann Luther, and Joe Skolecki. I'm also really excited to have Ginger Jackson-Gleich from the Prison Policy Initiative joining us to discuss prison gerrymandering. And with that, I will turn it over to John.
Thank you very much, Will. It's good to be here. And the map in front of you that you can see now is showing population growth over the history of the country since the founding in the 18th century. And it's just a fascinating depiction of the issues that we're going to be talking about here today. So obviously, people don't do redistricting all the time. It's only done every 10 years. So there's no one who's really an expert on it, but we're going to bring you the basic information and get into some details as well. But the fundamental point here is that over time, populations of some areas in the country increase, while populations of other areas decrease due to natural trends and births and deaths and in migration. But the borders of the legislative and congressional districts are usually set down in the law. So over time, the population of some districts will grow while others will shrink. And this ends up having the effect of diluting the clout of some voters while increasing the clout of other voters. And the courts have said that voters have a right to have their votes counted with approximately the same weight as that given to any other voters, which means that the government has to make sure that each elected official in the legislative body represents approximately the same number of people. Therefore, one political district must have approximately the same population as the next one within that same type of representative body, whether it's a state legislature, Congress, or a city council. And that's a case of the US Supreme Court called Reynolds v. Sims. So this concept is based on the 14th Amendment guarantee of equal protection under the law, which in this case means population equity. Unfortunately, there's a longstanding mechanism for ensuring population, for measuring population. The US Constitution mandates that the entire country perform a complete population census every 10 years. And that's been part of the Constitution since the founding. The National Decennial Census provides the population information needed to ensure that every federal, state, and local district in the country has approximately the same population. And where there's a population shift, the district lines, excuse me, can be changed to keep the population totals even. And this ensures equal representation and that concept of population equity. Next slide. So it starts with the US Census, which takes place every 10 years. The census was conducted in 2020 over a several-month period. A person's place of residence as of April 1st, 2020 is the place where the person is counted for the census. The census shows the population of the entire country, of each state, of each town, and smaller units called census blocks. And this data is used to draw the boundaries of all governmental districts. We can't redraw the boundaries of the states. So to ensure population equity among the 435 seats in Congress, the only option is to add a congressional district or take one away where population has shifted among the states. The total number of members of Congress in the House will always be 435. In Senate, it's always 2 per state, so it's 100. That doesn't change. Congressional seats also determine the number of electoral votes. And it's interesting to note that this year, in 2020, New York's population was just 89 short of the number that they needed to keep all of their congressional seats and electoral votes. And this is just a very, very small number, and it's kind of a reminder why the census matters so much. The first thing that comes out of the census is something called the apportionment report. It shows whether states gain or lose congressional seats. And that was just released 3 days ago, Monday of this week. More granular data is needed to check on the population at the state legislative district or even local district level, and that will be coming out. That more granular data will be coming out in August, and with a follow-up more user-friendly data in September. The states will be redrawing state legislative districts and any other districts based on this data. And of course, these district lines are not just a technical issue. It really impacts the political power of the parties and the population groups around the state, depending on how their strengths line up with district borders. Okay. There will be this year, as a result of the reapportionment, there will be a shift in political power to the southern and western states. The Northeast and Midwest will lose seats. Texas gained 2 seats, the largest change. Maine will keep its 2 seats. And according to news reports, if the 2020 census distribution were applied to the last presidential election, it would have shifted 3 electoral votes from Biden to Trump, reducing his total to 303. That's just an academic exercise to show the effect of the population shifts. And maybe that says something about future elections. The process of drawing the borders is potentially a very hot political issue, since how they cut across the population can determine which political party has more support. If left to their own devices, the party that controls the border drawing process would potentially have the incentive and the opportunity to divide up the voting population in a way that clusters its opponents in small number of districts, favors its own candidates, reduces political competitiveness, and in general tightens its grip on power. So redistricting raises issues of competitiveness and partisan gerrymandering. These incredibly odd-shaped districts you see depicted on this slide here. There are also issues of how to make sure that representational districts correspond to the borders of existing communities. There are questions about how to count people that are temporarily living in a certain location, such as a residential school, a military base, or a correctional facility. Next slide, please. And so timing is a big issue. There's not a lot of time to do this, and it's a complicated task. Maine used to finish the task by the 3rd year after the census, but in 2011, there was a lawsuit and basically said it's unfair to wait 3 years. You have to do it immediately. Once you have the data, you have to enforce that representational equity. And the courts agreed with that and ordered Maine to conduct the redistricting right away based on the 2010 census data. As a result of this, the Constitution was amended to change the process, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But now it has to be done before the next election, which in Maine will be 2022. So it really needs to be finished this year in order for the election to begin on time in the next year. In addition to considering the total number of people and where they live, drawing the district lines can involve issues of the organization of communities, respecting existing district boundaries, municipal boundaries, and issues around the geography and the geometry of compactness. Okay, next slide. Finally, in 2011, these are the maps that were produced in the partisan redistricting process in Maine. Proposed maps, you can see the one on the right was proposed by the Republican legislative contingent, the one on the left by the Democrats. You can see they had quite different borders between the 2 congressional districts there. The blue map was sort of more closely reflected the traditional boundaries. The red map was kind of a reimagining of how the districts could look, and it would have had the effect of changing the home district of an incumbent congresswoman, which caused a lot of consternation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt.
Thanks, John. So John mentioned that there was a recent constitutional amendment that sped up the process for redistricting here in Maine. And so what does the Constitution prescribe for reapportionment this year? Well, under the Constitution, there is a bipartisan commission that is charged with redistricting. It includes 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats, and then they choose a 15th member who is from neither of the 2 major political parties. And that commission is charged with producing by June 1st of the year following the year the census was conducted, so June 1st of this year, 2021, a reapportionment plan and district maps to be presented to the legislature. The legislature has only 10 days until June 11th to approve the plan presented by the commission or to adopt its own plan and maps, but that legislature must do so by a 2/3 vote of both houses, and therefore it's the commission's bipartisan plan that typically has the best chance of being adopted. If the legislature fails to adopt a plan by June 11th, then the Supreme Judicial Court of Maine has 60 days or until about August 11th to adopt a plan. Now, all of these deadlines are problematic this year due to the delays in the census that we'll be discussing more. Now, with that overview of the timelines, how are the members selected? Well, on the next slide, we see that many of the members of the commission come from the legislature. The Democrats currently have the majority in both the Senate and the House, and so that's why they're designated this way here. But you see that leadership of each party in the House chooses 3 members, leadership of each party in the Senate chooses 2 members per party, and then the chairs of the Maine Democratic and Maine Republican Party are members of the committee. And then the commission chooses 3 members from the public, with the parties each selecting 1 of their own to add to the number, and then those 2 public members choosing the final person who is to be unenrolled in either of the major political parties. That 15th member is really the linchpin of the process that's intended to ensure that neither party can exercise a controlling influence over redistricting. So who are the members of the commission this year? On the next slide, we see that the parties themselves have chosen their representatives. 14 out of the 15 folks have been selected. You see the names here. A number of them are familiar people in Maine politics, but the key 15th unenrolled member has not yet been selected. So that remains to be determined. What are the factors that this commission consider? On our next slide, you'll see that there are a number of things for the commission to both consider and to watch out for in the process of reapportionment. The first 4 listed here are set forth in the Maine Constitution. So districts must be geographically compact. They must also be contiguous, so you couldn't put together the west end of Portland with Machias, for example. They are supposed to respect political subdivisions to the degree possible, so crossing political subdivision lines as little as may be necessary to achieve the 4th factor, which is districts that are as equal in population as they can be. And this is how we ensure the principle of 1 person, 1 vote that John spoke about as being so important to the US Constitution. Now, Maine law also directs the commission to consider the possibility of preserving communities of interest, and we'll talk a little bit more about communities of interest in a moment. There are other factors that can be considered by the commission. We list a number of them here, but given time, we'll save those for questions if folks have any, and move on to thinking a little bit more on the next slide about communities of interest. So communities of interest are, in the view of the League, one key component of assessing the fairness of maps. So you would do so by judging, to the extent possible, whether or not there is a preservation of communities of interest. And as I mentioned, that this idea is enshrined in Maine law. The Redistricting Commission shall recognize that all political subdivisions are not of equal importance and give weight to the interests of local communities when making district boundary decisions. So in some instances, it may be that political subdivisions give way to communities of interest. And this is important because recognition of the in the redistricting process can be especially helpful to communities that have been traditionally left out of our political process. And so getting public input on behalf of communities of interest is important to the process. So what exactly are communities of interest? Well, they are groups of individuals with comparable legislative or community concerns based on similarities who would benefit from cohesive representation in government. This can be a racial or an ethnic group, although those factors cannot be the sole definition on which a district may be formed. You would also need to consider factors such as traditions, language, culture, etc. But there are other characteristics as well that might comprise a community of interest, and you see a listing of some of them here. One example of a district that appears to recognize a traditional Maine community of interest is the current House District 134, which comprises areas with a strong tradition of lobster fishing. So HD 134 includes Tremont on Mount Desert Island, Cranberry Isles, Deer Isle, Stonington, Vinyl Haven, a number of other islands. And while a drive from Tremont to Stonington by car would take you about 90 minutes, it's really just a short trip by lobster boat. And the district has been a safe seat for lobster men and women for some time. And indeed, the current incumbent is a lobster boat captain, as was her primary challenger in the most recent election. So with that overview of the process here in Maine, we're going to pass it to Anne to talk a little bit about the reality.
Well, it's maybe not as bad as this picture. This is a little hyperbole. It's not really a smoke-filled room anymore, you know, no smoking. And there are now some women on the commission, although that might not have been true in past centuries. Their meetings are ostensibly open to the public, although it's sometimes hard to figure out where and when the meetings are being held. But sophisticated mapping software, and each party has their own mapping software, means that each party comes in with their own map ideas. No one is necessarily drawing maps in the public interest. Almost everybody is drawing partisan maps. And then they sit down and they start, you know, trading. You know, they may trade, I'll give you this safe seat if you give me that safe seat. I'll protect this incumbent if you let me protect that incumbent. And so there's just a ton of horse trading that goes on. Each side protecting its own safe seats does not always lead to competitive districts. In fact, it seldom does. And when districts are not competitive, they're easier for hardline candidates to win. While the meetings are ostensibly open to the public, they haven't always been very well noticed. It's sometimes hard for ordinary members of the public to know when and where the meetings are being held, not to mention whether there's actually a public comment period being heard. And the maps that are under discussion are not well publicized. So even if you could make a public comment, you might not really know what you were commenting on unless you really worked hard to find out. So the bottom line, although Maine is by far and away not the worst in terms of partisan gerrymandering, it does have a little flavor of it. The districts can be a little bit less competitive. They can protect incumbents. It entrenches the power of the two major parties, and small party candidates and independents have no leverage at all. So it wouldn't be uncommon for a green independent, for a green incumbent, for example, to be have their district completely redrawn so that they could no longer hold it. Interesting to note that Maine's system, and it's not the worst in the world because, you know, it is bipartisan and it does require a supermajority. So the very extreme gerrymandering that we see in states like Wisconsin and in North Carolina, it's not possible in Maine. But even so, if the For the People Act passed, that's HR 1 S1, there are redistricting provisions there that would have an impact on Maine. Maine's process would have to change a little bit. All states, including Maine, would be required to use independent, nonpartisan commissions, not the bipartisan one that we have. Partisan gerrymandering at the congressional level would be expressly banned. The rules for drawing congressional maps would be uniform across the country, and the public would have a chance to review the maps and provide feedback. There would also be an expedited process for the public to challenge the maps. So those would be some of the changes that Maine might see if national reform came our way. Next slide.
Well, I will take it from here just for these next couple of slides, just to share a bit about how the census process has been going, where we stand. As you can see, and as many people have heard, you know, through the news, the data is late. The data has been, the apportionment data was finally released this week, more than 4 months past the legal deadline for reporting that. As we know, COVID caused massive delays in the actual process of counting. And as we know, as a result of this, the apportionment data, Maine will keep its 2 seats. And we've discussed some of the previous changes happening in other states from this apportionment data. So the granular data, as we said, that states need for redistricting may not be ready until September 30th, which is 6 months later than the legal deadline. Beyond the delay in in conducting the count and carrying that out, there's also been substantial delays in working to verify, make sure the data is up to the standard it needs to be. The data is not pretty, even with these delays. There's a lot of concern that it's been a rushed count, that the previous administration, tried to rush it through to essentially to exclude undocumented residents from the count. There's fears of undercounting, and you'll see this in the fact that while we mentioned that Texas gained 2 seats and Florida gained a seat, there have been lots of the projections for most people have been that Texas would gain 3 seats, Florida would gain 2 seats, and most people thought Arizona getting a seat was an extra seat was a lock, and those things didn't come to pass. And those are areas where the fact that those changes didn't come to pass suggests that hard to count populations such as immigrants, people living in multi-unit housing, and many Latino population members may not have been counted fully, and so this is something that's concerning, and I think we will continue to watch as the more granular data comes out. Some other issues with the count include secondhand information. A lot of if they can't get the data from visiting a household, often methods of asking neighbors, using other information to try to determine the count in a place are done, and these can be less reliable methods of determining the count. And finally, there's a aspect of manipulation of the data. So the census does not want to release the raw data. They want to use statistical methods to kind of obscure to add statistical noise to the data that's released so that it's not possible to identify single people, particularly in very small population segments. And there are lawsuits ongoing that Maine is actually part of challenging this. So that's something to continue to watch. And so I will turn it over to person slated to do this.
Yes. Yeah, thanks, Will. This slide shows the maps that will result from this process. This is obviously the current maps, 151 House districts on the left and 35 Senate districts on the right. In addition to those, obviously the congressional districts need to be drawn. So that's a total of 188 detailed maps that have to be, down every single house has to be put into one of those districts. So it's quite a technical challenge in addition to the political challenges that have already been described. And as noted, this whole package of maps is subject to super majority approval in the legislature. And if that fails, it goes to the Supreme Court. The cost of this is just about $280,000 to $400,000 for the state every 10 years. And I'll pass it back to Matt.
So as Will and John have explained, the census data regarding redistricting is not going to be received until September. And that's beyond all the deadlines that are prescribed by the Maine Constitution. So that's going to create problems. Moreover, the Secretary of State has indicated that her office would need the new maps and new redistricting data by November of 2021 in order to gear up for 2022 elections. So we can expect that if the delay compromises the quality of redistricting or impacts the 2022 elections, the state could face lawsuits. Legislative leaders naturally want to avoid those problems, and one solution might be going to the Supreme Judicial Court to ask that it consider what the Maine Constitution calls a solemn occasion, which is a serious question of law on which one branch of government needs advice from the court. This situation does seem to have many of the elements of what might qualify as a solemn occasion, but the court, of course, can only step in if asked to do so by another branch like the legislature. It appears that legislative leadership want the process to follow the usual commission process and approval by the legislature, but it remains to be seen how they will go about making that happen. And we may end up with problems down the line if things don't go smoothly. So we'll be in for a bumpy ride. To summarize, we have populations have shifted and grown more diverse over time. There's a lot at stake here in terms of representation of individuals in the government and communities of interest and the political parties themselves. The data is late and it's questionable in terms of its quality. We need to work those things out. There's a real risk of lawsuits. We frankly can expect that there may be some. We may first see a solemn occasion in advance of that. Maine can't meet its constitutional mandate, and the question of what that means is a serious one to be resolved. If everyone cooperates, we may not see problems, but if we have some bumps in the road, this could become quite a serious situation. We'll need an affirmative process to get this squared away. There's one specified by the Constitution, of course, that I think everyone would like to follow, but the census has really put us a little bit behind the 8 ball. And with that, we'll turn to Q&A, I believe.
With that, I will pass it to Joe Skalecki to introduce our guest.
Well, thank you, Will. My name is Joe Skalecki. I'm a member of the Maine League and a volunteer. It's my privilege to introduce Ginger Jackson-Gleich as our next speaker. Ginger is policy counsel for the Prison Policy Initiative, and that's where she helps advance the initiative's campaign to end prison gerrymandering. Ginger has been involved in criminal justice for over 15 years, joined PPI in between clerking for Judge Edward Chen in the Northern District of California, and also Supreme Court Justice Mariano Cuellar of the California Supreme Court. She attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill as a Moorhead Kane Scholar, and after graduation from there went on to Harvard Law, where she served as an editor of the Harvard Law Review and focused on criminal justice issues. Ginger spent her law school summers at the Criminal Law Reform Project of the ACLU and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. After law school, she also worked for the Alameda County Public Defender's Office, and she also does pro bono work representing people seeking compassionate release from federal prison. And with that, I'll turn it right over to Ginger. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you to talk about prison gerrymandering. I just want to check that you can hear me okay. The solemn, Zoom. Okay. The solemn Zoom opening. Now we're off. So I'm going to start by just explaining the basics of what prison gerrymandering is and what causes it. So prison gerrymandering is the practice of counting incarcerated people as residents, not of the places that they live, but of the places where they are detained, often detained for short periods of time. So again, it's taking somebody who's incarcerated in any correctional facility, a jail, a state prison, a federal prison, and counting that person as part of the population of a jurisdiction, or more specifically of a particular district, in order to pad the population of that district, despite the fact that incarcerated people have no constituent relationship with the elected officials from that jurisdiction or from that district. And despite the fact that there's really no representational relationship at all that typically exists between the people elected to represent districts with correctional facilities and the people who are within the closed confines of a correctional facility. Prison gerrymandering is really caused by the confluence of 3 factors. The first of those factors being census practice. So I believe it was Anne that alluded to this practice before, but the census counts people, has rules about where to count people who have unusual residential circumstances that might include boarding school students, military members, overseas missionaries. And it also follows this rule when it comes to determining where to count incarcerated people. And the Census Bureau interprets that rule as requiring it to count incarcerated people as residents, as I said before, not of their residential address where they lived and where they're likely to return, but as residents of the places where they're detained. So the second factor that really makes this dynamic into a problem is the problem of mass incarceration. So if it was only a handful of people in the United States that were detained in correctional facilities, the fact that the Census Bureau counts them in the wrong place wouldn't mean much. It wouldn't have much of a distorting effect, but we live in a country where more than 2 million people, as of the last redistricting cycle, were incarcerated, and that can have hugely corrupting or distorting effects on the effectiveness or the reliability or the accuracy of the data. So census practice meets mass incarceration, meets jurisdictions' typical reliance on raw or unadjusted census data. So as we'll talk about in a moment, many states and many local jurisdictions do adjust census data prior to doing their redistricting. In many, many places in the United States, that's permissible. There are a few states and jurisdictions that have interpreted their own laws or constitutions as prohibiting adjustment, but in many, many places in the United States, that's permissible, but it's very unusual, although increasingly common, to make those sorts of adjustments for prisons and other forms of correctional facilities. So those are sort of the three things that come together to cause the problem that we call prison gerrymandering. It's the way the census counts incarcerated people, the scope of incarceration in the United States, and the fact that states or local jurisdictions don't adjust their census data prior to redistricting. And I do just want to acknowledge that the redistricting process unfolds across levels of government. So we have federal or congressional districting, where we're drawing district lines for federal representation in Congress. And then we have the state level, where state legislatures, state legislative districts are being drawn. And then we have the local level of representation, which would include counties, cities and towns, school board districts. And it's overwhelmingly the case that prison gerrymandering sort of arises at the level of state and local government. So I think this was alluded to before. The federal apportionment data, which determines what, how many house seats each state is going to have, was released on Monday. We're now, becoming familiar with the fact that New York lost a seat, that it may have lost a seat by only 89 people. And so, in most normal years, the way that prison gerrymandering works and the way that the census counts incarcerated people, isn't typically determinative of congressional level districting. Those districts are so big that the scope of this problem at the federal level kind of washes out. But it seems possible that this year, this very unusual year, that prison gerrymandering could have been one of several explanatory factors that led certain states to lose representation and others to gain. So our analysis of that continues. I think, as other news outlets have made well available and people well aware, there are many reasons that could account for 89 people, but this may be the first year that we really see prison gerrymandering affecting that level of government. Nonetheless, I'm going to focus, or we almost always focus our attention today on, let me say that a little bit more clearly. I'm going to focus today on where we almost always focus our attention on this issue generally, which is at the state and local level. So I'll take the next slide. So the problem of prison gerrymandering really exists in two ways and differently at two levels of government. So the first problem that it causes is a transfer of power that's most prevalent at the state level, from urban areas to rural areas. And the other problem that it causes, which I'd say is more prevalent at the local level, is a distortion of equal representation, the idea that elected representatives each represent the same number of people. So let's dive into this first one, the transfer of political power first. And if you imagine, I've sort of fabricated a jurisdiction here. I fabricated a state where you can say there's a small rural population, there's two kind of mid-sized suburban populations, and there's a larger urban population. And if you think about this sort of fantasy jurisdiction, this fantasy state, if every 3 residents were to be able to, were be assigned an elected representative, you would see that the city would get 1 elected representative, 3 people there would get a representative. And then there would be most likely some sort of quasi-urban suburban district that would also get a representative. And then the other suburban area would get one, and the rural suburban group would probably get the last one. So the city would get a fair amount of representation. And Will, if you'll just click ahead and give me the next one too, so I can have the arrow. Yeah, so what we see when the census comes through, because urban people tend to be overrepresented in incarceration, we see incarceration rates being higher in urban areas, but transferred to rural areas to the places where they're actually incarcerated, when the census comes through to count and counts incarcerated people at prisons instead of at their home addresses, we see this, what looks like a transfer of population from an urban area to a rural area. And when that data is then used to draw redistricting lines, what happens is a movement of political power, a siphoning of political power away from urban areas to rural areas. And like I said before, this is probably the most prevalent at the state level, where we have within the state urban and suburban and rural areas. And we see that power transfer from the urban to the rural areas. And so I'll take the next slide. The other problem that we see most commonly at the local level is one of corruption or a distortion of equal representation. So if you imagine a city or a town that has 20 people living in it, if we then break that city or town down into its districts, I'll take the next little graphic. Yeah, you could imagine that each of those 4 districts would have 5 people in it. But if it turns out one of the districts has a prison, and it's the case that 4 of the people in one of those districts of 5 are actually incarcerated people with no constituent relationship to their elected official, it becomes clear that equal representation has broken down in this locality, and that in 3 of those districts, 5 people each get 1 representative. But in the last district, the one with the prison, that one person has an elected official all to themselves. So they effectively get more representation than people in the other districts do. So again, at the state level, the dynamic that we're really seeing is a movement of political power from urban to rural areas. At the local level, so that might be, again, counties, cities and towns, school districts, the more prevalent problem is this utter breakdown of the concept of equal representation. All right, so let's move ahead. I want to drill down just a little bit more into the specific circumstances of prison gerrymandering in Maine. And Maine, like many states, actually has a law that says that a prison cell, place of incarceration, is not a legal residence. So what the census is doing by counting people who are incarcerated as residents of the place where they're incarcerated is sort of inconsistent with the state law of Maine. So the state law of Maine says, a person does not gain or lose a residence solely because of the person's presence or absence while kept in any institution at public expense, which encompasses prisons and jails and things like that. So you get this sort of internal legal inconsistency with state law in Maine, like I said, also in many other states, and the census's determination about where somebody shall be counted. If you give me the next bullet, well, the other thing that's actually unusual about Maine when compared to other states is that Maine lets people in prison and jail vote. And so typically the way that works in Maine is that people vote absentee from their home district. So this makes the circumstance of prison gerrymandering especially unusual in Maine, because you would have somebody counted as a resident of one place, but actually voting for the political and elected leaders in another place, which just kind of amplifies how illogical and inconsistent this practice is. It kind of creates like an underloading of political constituents in the prison district, because the people who are technically the residents or the constituents of that elected leader, they're actually not, talking to them about issues or asking them for constituent services. They're asking a different elected leader who has his own or her own constituent sort of caseload. They're asking that elected leader for services, for help, for assistance, for representation. So it creates this real imbalance. And I'm going to take this actually a slightly bit out of order, but I want to call your attention to one specific example in Maine. So as I mentioned, we sometimes see prison gerrymandering in school districts, and there's a school administrative district in Maine, School District 40, that has a population of just under 15,000. And for the sake of representation, it's divided up into 5 districts, and each of those districts should have slightly fewer than 3,000 people in them. However, one of the districts within this school district has a prison that's just shy of 1,000 people. And so basically a third of that district is incarcerated people. Luckily, this school district has implemented a solution to this that I'm going to come back to in just a second. So let's go ahead. And actually, let's skip this slide because I want to come back to it in a second. So Maine has sort of teed us up to talk about solutions. And there are different levels of solutions, just as there are different levels of the problem. The best, most comprehensive solution to prison gerrymandering is legislation. And a nationwide universal solution to prison gerrymandering could be enacted by the passage of legislation by Congress. And actually, HR1 does contain language that would solve the problem of prison gerrymandering everywhere by directing the census to count incarcerated people, not where they're incarcerated, but at home. I think, for one thing, it remains to be seen if HR1 is going to pass. And it also, for the purposes of this districting cycle, is unlikely to affect the 2020 redistricting cycle. If HR1 is to pass, it seems most likely that it would affect the 2030 redistricting cycle, just because of the information that needs to be collected in order to make that possible. So Congress could pass legislation that would affect every jurisdiction across the United States simply by directing the census to change the way it counts. And I do also want to acknowledge, although it's not legislation, the census could make an administrative decision, promulgate a regulation that would on its own, without the directive of legislation, make this change, but we're not holding our breath to see that happen. It's also possible, but it doesn't feel particularly likely at this moment. So we could have federal legislation. In the absence of federal legislation, the states have stepped up to solve this problem within the boundaries of their own jurisdiction. So 10 states have now said, for state level redistricting, and in some cases for state and local redistricting, people will be counted at their legal residences, not at the place where they're incarcerated. So people will be transferred back to home, and redistricting will take place using that adjusted data. So 10 states have done that. A handful now in this cycle have pending legislation. One additional state, Michigan, hasn't solved the problem at the state level, but it has directed local governments to solve the problem. So it's a bit of a mishmash of solutions at this point. If states are considering legislation now without massive political will or support, it's unlikely that legislation that's passed at this stage of the redistricting cycle could change this redistricting cycle's outcome and direct that incarcerated people be counted at home. I do think that there's this horrible catch-22 about redistricting legislation, where when redistricting is on people's minds, legislatures seem to feel like it's too late. Like, we've already done the census, we're already in the process, it's too late to pass this legislation. But then once redistricting has happened, it sort of loses its urgency, and they think, okay, we'll deal with this down the road when it gets closer to the census time. So in some ways, I think legislatures love to conclude that there's never a good time for this legislation. And I think that actually means it's always a good time for this legislation. If we miss this redistricting cycle, so be it. 2030 will be better. So let's take some of the solutions. The good news here, if it sounds like there's nothing we can do for this cycle, the good news is that in the absence of legislation, there are still things that we can do. The important thing to note here is that the solutions for prison gerrymandering without legislation are very different at the state and the local level. So if a state or the federal government passes no legislation, they just get the raw census data. For purposes of state redistricting, state level districts, the best thing the state can do is just spread out its correctional facilities or its correctional populations among districts. Make sure the prison, the jail, the federal facility, they're not all dumped into one district, so that no one district is heavily diluted as compared to other districts. So the idea there is to spread out correctional facilities. At the local level, if there's no legislation that's passed, the best thing that a local jurisdiction can do is simply remove the incarcerated population prior to doing its redistricting. So Will, if you don't mind taking me back to the prior slide, I want to let people just see what I'm talking about. Perfect. So the situation on the left here is what happens if you use the raw census data. The census counts your 4 red incarcerated people as part of your population. You use that data, divide your population into 4 districts, and you end up with this very lopsided representation among your districts, where you have one representative representing, 1 person, and the other 3 representing 5. Totally lopsided forms of representation. But if a local jurisdiction removes the incarcerated population prior to redistricting and redistricts using a population that's sort of, you can think of it as true residents, then you get equal representation among your districts. Each of the districts then has 4 people who have and enjoy equal representation from their elected officials. I think it can sometimes make people nervous to talk about what does it mean to remove an incarcerated population, you know, who represents those people at this point. And the important thing to remember is that local jurisdictions, the only thing that they can control is the decisions that they make. They can't direct another jurisdiction to take back incarcerated populations. They could, if they knew that one of those 4 people was actually a resident of one of the other districts, you know, they can move incarcerated people around to sort of put them at home. But one city or one county can't tell another city or another county to kind of take back somebody who's become incarcerated within their own boundaries. So again, the way that the solution to prison gerrymandering works is very different at each level of government. The state can pass legislation or can spread out correctional facilities. Local governments don't have that same ability. And so the best thing that they can do is simply remove the incarcerated population. Will you take me to the end of that next slide? I do want to hit on the funding issue, which was my last point. So we very often see, you know, misreported in the media or elected leaders getting hung up on this issue of like, well, won't solving this problem cost us funding? Doesn't the census dictate which jurisdictions get funding? So if we send people home instead of counting them here at the prison, won't we lose funding? And the truth of the matter, which is surprising and may feel counterintuitive to people, is that there's no effect on funding formulas. And the reasons for that are several-fold. One is that when jurisdictions receive the redistricting data, they can do whatever they want with it and nothing gets fed back up to the state level or to the census. It just stays, redistricting data just stays in that jurisdiction for purposes of redistricting. So it doesn't go back up and the census says like, they removed their incarcerated population, so we're not going to give them, you know, this thing that we said that we were going to give them. So it just stays there in the jurisdiction. Importantly though, even if it did percolate back up to the census or to the state, those funding formulas have become so sophisticated that very few of them, you know, if any, rise or fall on total population counts. So school funding depends on the number of students, transportation funding depends on road mileage or mileage driven, things like that, that just don't, if total population feeds in, it's, you know, it's one of many variables and it's just reduced to minutia to correct for this problem. So I sort of tried to kind of race through this. I just want to recap kind of where we've been. Prison gerrymandering it's the practice of using incarcerated populations to pad district populations, despite the utter lack of a representational relationship between incarcerated people who again are living in this very closed community. The lack of a representational relationship between those folks and an elected official. And it's caused by this census practice of counting incarcerated people as residents of the places where they're detained instead of at their home addresses. The good news is that there are solutions, that there's a federal solution in the form of HR 1. States are taking action such that more than 1/3 of people in the United States now live in a place that has corrected for prison gerrymandering. Those 10 states include some of the biggest ones, New York, now Illinois, California. So we're talking about a real building tide of a solution here. But the good news is that even if Maine isn't going to be one of those states for the 2020 redistricting cycle, there are still solutions at the state level and at the local level that jurisdictions can take. And as School District 40 in Maine shows, have already taken, there's a tradition of this in Maine to correct for some of these problems. So I encourage anybody who's interested in redistricting to remain vigilant of this issue in Maine at the state and at the local level, or to the extent that you're interested to help champion some of that legislation in Congress, HR 1 and S1, which could fix this. Okay, I think that I've run out of time, so I'll leave it there and turn it over to questions. Well, I think I have one more slide with website information if people are interested.
Great. Well, we can go ahead and take questions from here. Joe, I know you had a couple of questions that you wanted to pose. If you'd like to ask a question now, and if anyone has any, you can put them in the Q&A box and we'll make sure that those get asked as well.
Thank you, Will. I did put them right at the top of the of the chat just before we went online. But Ginger, Anna had asked me to put a couple questions together just to get the ball rolling. And my two questions are, what amount and degree of resistance do you usually get from lawmakers and all the other vested interests when you lobby for ending this particular situation? And then what types of resistance have you experienced from these same folks, and how do you overcome them?
Great, that's a great question. And I'm gonna sort of back into my answer by answering an adjacent question first and then kind of talking about that. So one of the things that I totally forgot to mention is that I think one of the things that's kind of magical about prison gerrymandering is that it really, as in the best other forms of solutions to partisan gerrymandering and things like this, need not be a partisan issue. We've seen leadership on solving prison gerrymandering emerge from Democrats and Republicans. Republicans in Alaska and Tennessee and California have been real leaders in the campaign to end prison gerrymandering. And so I just wanted to note that it's not an issue. I think people sometimes look to the urban-rural transfer of power and make an assumption that that would be something that sort of corresponds to a Democrat-Republican win-loss calculus. But you know, in the 2 decades that Prison Policy Initiative has been working on this, I think they've been really delighted to see that leadership is emerging from both sides, and that prison gerrymandering solutions have arisen both in places where the problem of prison gerrymandering is relatively small, where the distorting effects are relatively minor. But often we see leadership in places where it's the biggest, where you get an entire district that would be a prison because the prison population is that large. And somebody in the county commission or the city council looks around and says, like, this just can't be right. And so you see the solutions emerging from some of the states that or the local jurisdictions that have the biggest problems. So not only is there opportunity for bipartisanship, there's also opportunity to collaborate in the smallest and in the biggest of problem scenarios. That's not to paint an overly rosy picture and say nobody ever, resists this. I think that the funding issue, this sort of, unfortunately, it's a straw man, it's a non-issue, is really one of the things that we see over and over and over again, jurisdictions that are contemplating change getting tripped up on. And it's a persistent misconception that has caused a lot of challenge, in the campaign for prison gerrymandering reform. So I would say that I think that starts to give you a sense of the answer to that question. Anytime that a political leader, fears the loss of their seat or what's been guaranteed, I think we've seen resistance come from people who feel like without a prison population, they wouldn't be able to hang on to their seat. But we've also seen people who say, I'm going to take the high road here, and I don't want, if giving up this population, of correcting this problem means that I lose my seat, I don't want to keep my seat because I'm not entitled to it. So I think that's, at its best, we've seen real leadership in that area. And then what was remind me of the crux of your second question. It was kind of like, how do we get around some of this resistance?
Yeah, essentially, when you do encounter it, you're dealing with a lot of different human needs and wants and calculus. So what are some of your best solutions to overcome them and get them to decide that there is a better way? Yeah,
I think there's 2 answers to that question also. And one is to be present at every level of representation. That part of what we're doing is speaking with people at town council meetings, at city council meetings, consulting with school boards, showing up to state legislature, special sessions and things like that to talk about that. And on the one hand, it sort of means, as we've seen, you can solve this problem at various levels. So sometimes if you start at the local level where the problem is the biggest, you get that jurisdiction to solve that problem. And then you can go up to the state and say, the place you thought would be the most entrenched has actually already solved this. And so we would encourage the whole state to get on board with this. And sometimes it happens in the reverse, that things are really entrenched at the local level and more fluid at the state level. And so you kind of go where the opportunities are. But it is a unique situation that can be solved kind of at many levels of government that do bear on each other. So that would be one. And then one of the other challenges that we face here is that New York was a great example of this, where New York had major prison gerrymandering problems until they passed legislation about a decade ago. And one of the dynamics that created was a situation where elected officials relied on prison populations in order to be, sort of viable for election. And that meant that they entrenched policies that enshrined mass incarceration. So there was broad public support, for example, for repealing the Rockefeller drug laws. But some of the people who had prisons in their district, saw themselves as benefiting from keeping those prisons full. And so they resisted repealing those laws. And so we see this kind of entrenchment of mass incarceration because people are benefiting from those situations politically. And I realize that I'm answering your question about solutions with the problem, but I think it sort of gives you some of the context of how we fight this fight and where it's been sticky and where we've been able to make progress. But I do think, one of the hard things about this issue is with all redistricting is getting people to pay attention to the problem. And once people start to say like, what? There's a prison in my district where people have no relationship with the elected official, where the elected official can do nothing on behalf of those people. And yet 4,000 of them are being counted in my district. Like what? And that's where it starts to move. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for those thoughtful answers and for that very, very informative presentation. I'm really, really grateful we were able to have you join us today and present. So thank you so much. Before we leave, I want to just wrap us up with a couple of ways that people can take action. First is follow us on all of our social media. We don't let people know enough that we're on all the platforms on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and we're posting lots of great stuff there. So do that. And then finally, if you haven't yet, you can take action. You can contact Senator King and Senator Collins and urge them to support the For the People Act. And we would really appreciate that. We need all the energy we can get around it. So that would be very helpful. And finally, I just want to thank everyone for joining us. I want to thank our co-sponsors. I want to thank our panelists. Thank you all so much. I know I've learned a lot today, and I hope you have too. And if you have any questions, please reach out to us on social media, email, anywhere. So with that, I will wrap it up and thank you all. Have a great day.